Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are digging into a source that offers a really provocative take on the history of Detroit. It argues that a deliberate, calculated campaign of social engineering completely reshaped the city and, well, its people. So, the source we're examining today kicks things off by challenging the story most of us know about Detroit's decline. It asks us to just consider for a moment, what if what we think we know is only half the picture? For example, pretty much everyone has heard of the destruction of the historic Black Bottom neighborhood to build the I-375 highway. It's a well-documented tragedy. But the source we're looking at today says that this well-known story actually hides another one, the intentional dismantling of Detroit's very powerful Polish community. So, you gotta ask, why them? Why does the author claim this specific community was targeted? Well, the source gets right into what it calls the Polish problem, at least from the perspective of the era's industrialists. You see, the article argues that the Polish community was this incredibly tight-knit and organized group. They lived together in these dense enclaves, they had real political power, especially through the unions, and they were seen as pretty resistant to mass media. Because they value their community and their faith over just making more money, the source says they were an independent power base, a real thorn in the side for the people who wanted to control the city's workforce. And this quote from the source material, man, it really gets to the heart of the author's whole argument. It wasn't just that they were workers. It was their built-in social structure as an ethnic and religious group that made them this incredibly powerful force in the labor movements that industrialists were so desperate to get a handle on. Okay, so let's get into the how. How, according to this source, was this community actually dismantled? The author lays out what they call a playbook, a whole set of social engineering tools that were supposedly used against them. First off, the source argues that industrialists like Henry Ford deliberately pitted different ethnic groups against each other. They saw the organized Polish workers as truculent and demanding, while at the same time, they were actively recruiting Southern Black workers during the Great Migration, who they believed would be more pliable and less likely to join a union. All right, so the next tool the article points to is federal housing policy. The claim here is that so-called urban renewal projects, bankrolled by the federal government, weren't used to improve the city at all, but were actually used as a weapon to strategically break up these tight-knit ethnic neighborhoods. And the article presents the Sojourner Truth Homes incident as this perfect case study. Apparently, federal planners ignored local advice and decided to put a new housing project right on the edge of the Polish community. When the Poles protested, the feds didn't back down. No, they brought in state troopers and even undercover agents to force it through. According to the source, this set a huge precedent that federal power could, and would, be used to break up an ethnic enclave. Then, the source points to the legal system itself as another key tool. It argues that a few landmark court decisions actually built the entire legal foundation needed for these kinds of social engineering projects. Now, this is where it gets really fascinating. The source highlights these three very famous Supreme Court cases. All of them were decided within just 6 years. And the author's argument is that together they created a legal arsenal. Shelley v. Kramer took away a community's legal ability to keep its ethnic character. Berman v. Parker gave the government sweeping new powers to seize private property for renewal. And Brown v. Board, well, that set the stage for policies like forced busing. The source also talks about a major economic weapon, blockbusting. By intentionally stirring up racial fears to get people to sell their homes in a panic, real estate agents could then swoop in and buy up entire neighborhoods for pennies on the dollar. This effectively just wiped out the main source of a community's generational wealth. So, you've got all these different strategies in play. What was the end result, according to the article? Well, the source basically draws a straight line from all these actions to a massive, engineered exodus from the city. The author points directly to the 1967 riot, which kicked off after a police raid on an illegal bar, as the absolute tipping point. It's framed as the final straw that just unleashed this wave of mass panic and sent the city's remaining white residents heading for the exits. And this chart from the source, wow, it really visualizes the sheer scale of that exodus. The data shows the number of white residents leaving Detroit each year more than doubled right after the '67 riot, and then nearly doubled again the year after that. The source itself calls it a hemorrhage. In the author's view, this mass departure wasn't about segregationist laws. Not at all. Instead, the source claims it was directly caused by a feeling that law and order had completely collapsed, leaving residents feeling like they had no protection from the city's leaders. Then the article describes what it calls a final, symbolic act that took place in the 1980s. Under Mayor Coleman Young, the city used that same eminent domain power, the one expanded back in Berman v. Parker, to completely level the last remnants of the Polish neighborhood, known as Poletown, just to make way for a new General Motors plant. Okay, so here's the real kicker, according to the author. The publicly stated goal of all this was, racial harmony, integration, but the source claims the real result, and maybe the real goal, was what it calls deracination, basically erasing a group's ethnic identity. These communities lost their political power, they got scattered, and they became this sort of generic suburban population defined by class and consumer habits, which, the author argues, made them a whole lot easier to control. Now, the source doesn't just leave this story in the past. To wrap things up, it draws a direct and pretty controversial line from the history of Detroit to some of the biggest political debates happening right now. This statement right here is incredibly provocative, and it basically sums up the author's final argument, that this whole strategy of using migration and demographic shifts as a tool for social engineering, well, it isn't something new. The author claims it's a long-standing and, in their words, a very American policy. So the author presents this idea of a recurring pattern. The argument laid out here is that a similar strategy is being played out again. As the table shows, the source claims that where the target was once these tight-knit ethnic groups, now it's small-town communities. The tool has shifted from internal migration to global mass immigration, but the alleged goal remains the same: break down social cohesion to make control easier. So why does any of this matter? According to the source, by taking away the freedom of association, by taking away a community's ability to define itself, the only tool left to create a stable, safe neighborhood is just money, cold, hard economic exclusion. And this, the author says, forces everybody into a senseless rat race just to buy some peace and security. And that brings us to the end of our explainer on this source. It leaves us with a pretty big final thought about history itself. How do we, as a society, end up deciding which stories get told over and over again until they become memory, and which ones just get forgotten?